Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at Waypoints at Home, our house church evening. We're super excited that you are with us tonight, so thank you. Thank you for making tonight a priority. Thank you for gathering with some family and friends and diving in with us tonight. Tonight we're going to continue the series that we began last week. If you missed it, I want to encourage you to watch it on YouTube. It sets up tonight so much, and it's just one of those you don't want to miss, so make sure to check that out. So the brand new series is simply called The Bible. While most people know some of the Bible stories, most people don't know the story of the Bible. In fact, one of the reasons why it has been so easy to dismiss the Bible or Christianity in general is because nobody ever sat down and explained to you the story of the Bible. And part of the reason they didn't explain the story of the Bible to you as a child is because, A, you weren't interested, and the other reason is the people who gave you the Bible probably did not know the story of the Bible themselves. And so we need to understand this, the Bible. It's a big deal. It's a big deal to our culture. It's a big deal to your life. It's a big deal to Christianity in general. And it might actually be the biggest deal for those of you who grew up in the faith but have chosen to walk away. Understanding how we got the Bible is almost as important as understanding what is in the Bible. The backstory sheds a whole lot of light on the story. Now, I could go and I could survey, say, 100 people and ask them, where do you think the Bible came from? And we get all sorts of answers. And some of them are crazy, but we get all sorts of answers about where the Bible came from. And once again, if we don't know the story of the Bible, it's easier to dismiss everything inside it. So last week, we talked about the reality that the story of the Bible does not begin in the beginning. It doesn't begin in Genesis. The story of the Bible actually begins a little towards the end of the middle when Jesus is discovered alive after he dies on the cross. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, there would be no reason to write about it. And the reason that men and women decided to document the life of Jesus was not because of what he taught. It wasn't that he was crucified, and it wasn't even about who he claimed to be. It was because he rose from the dead and hundreds of people saw him. And when they saw him alive, these men and women who before this were running for their lives, afraid of being arrested, they now go into the streets of Jerusalem and they proclaim what they have seen with their own eyes, the resurrected Jesus. And in that moment, the church began. And that's where I want to pick up our story for tonight, for this week. The Apostle Paul and others now leave Jerusalem, they leave Judea, and they begin to tell Gentiles about Jesus. Now, a Gentile is simply a non-Jewish person. And they begin to tell them about Jesus. And the biggest struggle for Gentiles who wanted to embrace the life of Jesus, to embrace Jesus as their Savior, was actually embracing the idea that there was only one God. Now, to you and I, we're like, well, that's no big deal. And that's because most of us are not polytheists. We don't believe in more than one God. But for them, that is exactly how they grew up. So they would be giving up everything they were brought up to believe. See, most of the people in the ancient world believed in multiple gods. And so they'd be giving up everything that everyone else around them also believed. It would be like many of you who grew up believing in God, all of a sudden stop believing in God. It would be those of you who don't believe in God to all of a sudden start believing in God. It's an unimaginable shift, a change in their minds and understanding. Also know in the ancient world that people didn't just convert from one religion to the other. They did not leave Islam to become Christians or leave Christians to become Buddhists or leave Buddhism to become a Hindu. That's not how it worked, because there weren't religions like that. You see, every region, every nation, the barbarians, the Romans, the Greeks, they all had their own gods. And most families had family gods. They would worship their ancestors. And so when you moved from place to place, you just took your gods with you. You literally would just put the idols in a sack and you would bring them. And when you got to your new place, you would set up a family altar. And nobody really cared what gods you worshiped or served. In fact, you may then begin to adopt some of the gods from the region that you currently are living into. Or if something bad started happening to you while you were worshiping gods, you would just simply take that statue and you just throw it into the fire and say, well, that's not really my God. The world then was very, very different. And then Christianity comes along and says, no. Now you have to give up all of your gods. In fact, you should know this. The first and second century Christians were actually considered atheists. Yeah, the Christians were actually considered atheists. Why? Because the Christians didn't believe in the gods. And then you add a new God and claim that new God is actually the only God. And so therefore you must be an atheist. And so Gentiles coming to believe in Jesus, they love that idea. But this idea of there just being one God seemed to be very novel and very new. Now, this is really important for our journey. We're going to talk about it tonight. We'll talk about it a little bit next week as well. But this is probably something nobody has ever told you. See, when the Gentiles became enamored with one particular Jew, that would be Jesus, when they became enamored with Jesus and the Jewishness of Jesus, they also became enamored with the Jewish texts. Now, before Jesus came, that was not the case. I mean, there was always this really tiny percentage of Gentiles who would follow Judaism closely, as closely as they could. And occasionally somebody would actually be baptized and go through the ceremony of going from being a Gentile to a Gentile version of a Jewish person. But those were extremely rare. For the most part, the Gentiles were not interested in any of the Jewish sacred texts. And there was a lot of good reasons why not. First of all, the Jews just completely kept to themselves. Second of all, the Jewish had weird diets, right? They ate different food, and Jewish people refused to work on the Sabbath. And so the Gentiles just find all of that extremely strange. And then add the fact that the Jews would not allow you to marry their daughters and would not allow their sons to marry your daughters. And in the first century, the Jewish people just were kind of off to themselves. As an example, we know in the first century that the Apostle Peter, who was an extreme Jesus follower, right? 15 years after Jesus rose from the dead, he had not entered a Gentile home yet because the Jewish law had outlawed that, right? And so he'd probably never been invited to a Gentile's home. There were pockets of Jews in every major city throughout the Roman Empire, Ephesus and Rome and Corinth and Galatia, but they always seemed to just keep to themselves. So the Gentile people had virtually no interest in the Jewish religion and virtually no interest in Jews until they were introduced to the gospel, and then they were introduced to the teachings of Jesus and the claims of Jesus, and then they started encountering Jews like Paul and Peter. And now these guys, they're acting completely different. They aren't like the other Jews. And they say that their uniqueness is because of the fact that they are eyewitnesses to the resurrection. And so now, because of Jesus, because of the Gospels, now they have an interest in the Jewish texts. And they discovered in the Jewish texts what they would call the law and the prophets, not the Old Testament, that comes way later. But when they discovered the laws and the prophets, they discovered the backstory to this new story. And they became interested in it. And they were interested in Judaism. And that's going to cause problems later on, but not right now. They were interested in finding Jesus in the texts of the Jewish people. Now, to their amazement, when they began to explore the texts of the Jews, they didn't even know what to call some of these books, these letters, these documents. It took them about to the middle of the 2nd century before the Gentile church was even able to assemble a list of Jewish texts that they felt was important to the story. But what they discovered in this Jewish religion was that it is older than the religions of the Romans, and it was older than the religions of the Greeks. And they discovered that the Jewish people had always, from the very beginning, only believed in one God, Yahweh. Now, a little bit of history for you before we get back to the plot line, because this is just important. During the 1st and the 2nd century and some of the 3rd century, Christians were some of the most persecuted people in the Roman Empire because, as I told you last week, Christians would not worship or declare Caesar as Lord. But the Jews never worshiped or honored the Greek or Roman gods either. They would not declare that Caesar was Lord, but they never experienced any persecution. And the question would have to be, well, why? Why did the Roman empires give the Jews a pass, and yet they would persecute the Christians? I mean, the Jews were just as guilty as the Christians for not declaring Caesar as Lord or not honoring any of the Roman guards. So why did the Romans leave the Jews alone? Well, they left the Jews alone because of one very important thing. Romans always honored ancient things that last a long time. And so the Romans knew that the Jewish religion was actually older than their story of Romulus and Remus. And the Jewish religion was older than the pantheon of the Greek gods. And so they recognized that the Jewish scriptures and the Jewish religion were older than any other religion. And so even though they didn't honor Yahweh as a god, they honored the fact that the Jewish religion was the oldest religion. And because of that, they honored the Jews, and the Jews got a pass. Now, when these Gentile Christians began exploring these Jewish scriptures for the first time, they were truly shocked to discover that this oldest religion that no one really knew about had recognized that there was only one God, and they had done that from the very beginning. Since ancient time, every other single nation in the world, known world at that time, worshipped multiple gods. And that every family also worshiped their ancestors, and every single culture since ancient time had been wrong. That's what they discovered. They opened the first segment of the Jewish text that you and I call Genesis, and here's what they found, something very shocking. And I'm going to slowly walk through the very first verse. And it says this, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, "In the beginning, God." Just stop there. See, we have heard this so many times, we've read it so many times that we're missing the shocking moment, just in the 4th word, right? What they found so shocking was it's different from every other creation story. In the ancient creation stories, in the world, throughout the world, they would find something like, "In the beginning, the gods," plural. But the Genesis story, in fact, the word Genesis is a Greek word and actually means origin. So the origin story, that first book in the English Bible, they found something interesting. And it affected every single one of them, and it affects every single one of us. Now, there's something interesting that happens between the 19th and 20th centuries, this era in which you and I have lived. Archaeologists have made some claims that have found Genesis to be a little suspect. Archaeologists have created some doubt regarding the origins of the Jewish Genesis creation account. And many of us were taught these sorts of things in school, and here's where the doubts came from. See, the archaeologists, they discovered the Egyptian and the Canaanite and the Babylonian creation stories. And they discovered between those 3 texts and the Jewish text that there were some similarities. And so their initial assumption was this, that these ancient Hebrew texts actually borrowed from other ancient creation stories. But here's what you need to know. It's so important. That theory, that thought that they have borrowed from the creation story, that the Jews borrowed from these other creation stories, that thought has been abandoned by almost every single historian and scholar. See, not only does Genesis not borrow from other creation stories, Genesis stands in a stark contrast to other ancient creation stories, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. See, Genesis is a worldview upon itself. It's ahead of its time. In fact, the scientific community, the modern scientific community, wouldn't even begin to catch up with the first statement in Genesis until 1927, when a Belgian priest first suggested a theory that's simply called the Big Bang Theory. Not the TV show, right? The actual theory of how the universe began. See, since the time of Aristotle in the 4th century BC, everyone pretty much assumed that the universe just simply existed. In fact, Albert Einstein embraced this idea that the universe had just always been. But in 1964, with the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation, maybe some of you studied that in school, I don't know. But this view that the universe always existed was completely abandoned. So science has come along and it has changed a lot of things. And so scientists has come along and they all pretty much agree that when in a trillionth of a second, the universe expanded at an extraordinary speed from something as small as a pebble to this astronomical scope that it is today. In other words, the words in Genesis, in the beginning, everything was created. In the beginning, that has everything that has a beginning also has a cause. Not everything has a beginning and not everything has a cause, but everything that has a beginning has a cause. And this cause in the creation story is God. He speaks everything into creation, the bang of it all. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 continues. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earths. Now, the significance, and this is what I want you to get because it's such a big deal, especially if you're struggling with Genesis. Moses, the author of this, isn't trying to explain how God created the heavens and the earth. That's where we get things all mixed up. That's not the point. Moses' point, why he's writing this, is to set them apart from everyone else. See, Moses is making the point that God created the heaven and the earth, not the gods, just Yahweh. And Moses is writing to an ancient group of people who all they've known is slavery. Slavery where? In the land of the Egyptians, who have multiple gods, this pantheon of gods. And so Moses is trying to help them to narrow their focus, help them to know, help them to re-believe, to become atheists, as they would say, as related to these Egyptian gods, and become believers in only one God, Yahweh. See, Genesis is nothing like the Egyptian creation story. It's nothing like the Canaanite creation story. It's nothing like the Babylonian creation story, where gods are at odds with themselves. They're at war with each other, and where gods actually create other gods out of body parts and body fluid, and they're all really strange stories. And this brings up the next big epic ahead of its time statement, and this is extraordinary. See, the Babylonian creation myth, it's huge. I think it covers like 5 books. It's like 5 books into it before you ever get to the creation of humanity, of mankind. And mankind is created basically to serve all of these really lazy gods. And so after becoming the chief of the gods, the king of all gods, Marduk, he actually says this statement. It's so important. Please read it. It says this: I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Savage man I will create, and he shall be charged with the service of the gods, and they might be at ease. In all of the ancient creation myths and mankind and humankind is an afterthought. It takes the load off of the gods to lighten the load of the gods. Because of the way the ancient people embraced these ancient mythologies about their gods, individuals, they had absolutely no rights. Women had absolutely no rights. There was no intrinsic value to anyone. And so the violence and the injustice of the gods just simply justified the violence and the injustice of their leaders, because they were just acting like their fathers and mothers in heaven. But Genesis is completely different. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, it says, then God said, let us make human beings. See, humans are not an afterthought. Humans are not created to be slaves to God. In the Genesis narrative, the creation story, humanity is God's crowning creation. They are made in his image. And so the dignity of every man, of every child, of every woman comes from the fact that they are created in the image of God. It's established from the very beginning of the human story, and that's completely unheard of. There's no parallels anywhere. The pagan mythologies and the pantheons of gods that would develop after this through the ages, none of them would establish this kind of thought, this kind of idea. But wait, there's still more. What comes next is even more unthinkable. See, this is part of why later archaeologists and later scholars decided that the Jews did not borrow from any of these other ancient myths. Here's what the text says. Genesis chapter 1, the rest of 26, it says, "Then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us." See, Moses is introducing a radically different, unparalleled, untested worldview. This would be the foundation of what would later be called the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is not reflected in nature. And let's be honest, the Golden Rule is not always reflected in humanity either. But the idea was introduced in the very beginning when God says, you are not a means to an end. He says, I'm going to make you as close to me as possible. I'm going to make you in my image, which means every man, every woman, every child you ever come face to face with bears the image of their Creator. Be careful how you treat them. The text then continues. God says, let us make human beings in our own image like us, and they will reign over. See, let us make humanity, not just in the image of our likeness, but let's make them to rule. Not to worship or to be worshiped, but let's make them so that they can rule. They can rule over the seas of the fish, the birds of the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals. See, God is establishing a unique worldview. God is empowering humanity. You need to understand that our God has a high view of humanity. And according to the ancient gods, you had no individual dignity, you had no individual rights, there was no redeemer, there's no afterlife. According to new atheists, if you were born a slave to your DNA, then you have no free will, there's still no redeemer, there's no afterlife. But in the beginning of the creation story, we are introduced to our God who saves, who redeems, who delivers, and who never ever gives up on you. In the very beginning, God gives us freedom to choose, and then God honors our choices. And when our choices lead us away from Him, then Yahweh does the most ungodly thing imaginable. He goes to work to reverse the consequences of humanity's decisions. See, Genesis 1 creates and gives us, it provides for us a narrative of our lives. The big picture context for our human experience, right? Why are we here? Why do we matter? That gives us a purpose. And with a purpose, you and I are not a result of some sort of cosmic conflict between gods who did not create the universe. See, God wanted image bearers who could know and relate to one another, and image bearers who could know and relate to Him. And when the time was right, when everything was just as it needed to be, Yahweh, our God, He actually joins us in Jesus. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to those first century Gentiles. The first century Gentiles, when they read this opening line of the Hebrew Bible, they realize that the Jews had it right all along, which of course only fueled their interest in the laws and the prophets, the Hebrew scriptures, and they moved quickly to adopt the Hebrew scriptures as their very own Christian scriptures, setting the stage of the inclusion of the Jewish scriptures in the Christian Bible. But that inclusion is going to cause some struggles, and that's where we're actually going to pick up the story next time. But I want to leave you with something important, and as we're just talking about Genesis. I know that Genesis is a complicated thing, as it just relates to science, as it relates to faith. And so if you're in that place where Genesis just kind of makes you stumble a little bit, I want to recommend a book for you, a resource. John Lennox is a mathematician and Oxford professor, and did that for many, many years. And he's written several books, but he wrote a book called 7 Days That Divide the World, the beginning according to Genesis and science. And if the book of Genesis has been an obstacle for faith for you, and the book of Genesis is something that you're curious about and you wonder, how does this line up with modern science? And I just want to highly recommend this resource. And here's why I'm taking time to talk about it. I don't want any of you to spend another season of your life with leftover questions from college or grad school or high school or a book you read or a blog you read or something someone told you one night, those things that have rocked your faith as you know it. I don't want any of you to spend another season there. So as you decide and as you journey and as you navigate through the complexities of real life and the ancient world and Jesus and all we've been told, may this resource, may it be helpful for you taking the next step. So I just want you to know about it. Well, I'm going to pause my part of the conversation, and I'm going to ask you to engage your part of the conversation. And it's hard for me to come up with a question tonight, so I'm just going to ask you, so what do you think? What came up in this conversation as we're talking about ancient creation stories and God's creation stories and how he's just got this completely unique narrative? And how does that change you and where you're at with all of this? Have a great discussion. We'll talk to you later. Take care.